Hello, and welcome to a new series on leftism and climate change. This series is coming off the back of the pitch of the public discourse that we're often hearing when it comes to things like the emission of carbon, the emission of methane, and the various policies and laws being implemented in order to attempt to combat this, or whether it's the subsidization of certain types of green technology. And so, what I'm wanting to do here is fill in an important part of the climate debate, which is less concerned with the scientific publications or statistical data, depending on what free radicals or what kind of chemical compounds are being released, but looking more towards the political ideology which is associated with climate change and ecology. In fact, what we'll be looking at is specifically called dialectical ecology. So this is the union of leftist thought and the ideas of climate change, and climate change is going to have a quite specific meaning later on. But anyway, you should know my name's Max Reynolds. I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. Here we're now looking at totalitarian thought as it pertains to the environment. Lecture 1, much like the previous series on the development of queer theory, is going to start off in the same area. It's important to lay the groundwork so that you can understand how leftist thought progresses. It's got a very specific means of reasoning. It's got a specific way of looking at the world post-Marx. So it's important to get the groundwork right so we can understand how certain developments are made, and also in order to correctly understand why later developments are made in the fashion that they are, in the way they are. So in this one, we're going to again go through Marx's methodology. I've improved some of the diagrams and the presentation. The audio should be better. There's the same key ideas, which is Marx rejects the law of identities. He's got this conception of historicism. So like Hegel, history is advancing towards a known end, and all of being needs to be oriented towards that known end. And he also has concepts of labour and alienation, which straddle the movement across time from a period in which there is labour, in which there is alienation, to undoing those things. And then there's a dialectical Jerusalem at the end of history, and without labour and alienation. So undoing those things is very important. And an important part of Marx's system is the union of humanity at the species level with nature and the wider world. So that, at the end of Marx's system, forms a monadological product. And lastly, we've got some insights from Engels on nature. So quickly, we're going to go through methodology and philosophy once again. And if you've seen the previous series, you'll recognise this image. It's the wagon wheel, and I think it's probably the best way of describing some of the aspects of Hegel's philosophy, at least from the subjective perspective. And so a wagon wheel has different component parts, and what I use this to represent is the individual, the ideas they have, and how they're all interconnected with one another. So you could imagine that if you were wearing this wagon wheel as a rather awkward hat, the hub would be on top of your head. That would be the subject aspect. So that's you as you're having the ideas. And in Hegel's system, you reflect ideas out of your consciousness. So you've got the connection, which is the spoke, and then the idea itself would be the fellow, which is at the end of a spoke or a connection of spokes. And then there's a band which goes around the entirety of the system of ideas. So all ideas are reflections of one another. They're all interconnected. So the important thing here, which is taking place within Hegel's methodology and which is recapitulated in Marx's methodology, is there's a rejection of the law of identity. Something is not quite just itself. It is inherently is beyond connected. It's reflected within all of the other ideas. And so if you're looking to structure the way that your consciousness moves through a series of ideas, as takes place in Hegelian and Marxist philosophy, then it's quite a useful tool, because you can use it to essentially prejudge that ideas are interconnected with one another. It's a useful cognitive tool, but as soon as you begin to map it onto reality in an erroneous way, then it leads to spectacular and horrendous consequences. Now, in addition to having this model of how cognition and how ideas are progressed, and this is just being a visual representation of it, there's also historicism, which is the advancing of time, and in Hegel's system, all of the developments in philosophy, he was trying to nest them under moving towards a goal. And so what you'll do is you'll take all of the old Greek philosophy, and then there would be philosophy that take place afterwards, and these would all be logical outgrowths of it, and it would develop and develop and develop. And then what Hegel's trying to do is saying, okay, well, we're before the end, so I'm going to try and prejudge what the end is. And that's the historicism, is that you are moving towards some sort of known end. So that's established first in Hegel, but you can see it very clearly in Marx's system as well later on when we come back to it. So the idea would be that you would, at one point in time, you would have, one wagon wheel, you'd have all a set of ideas which are prevalent at that moment in time, but you're not at the end of history yet. So you need to essentially cause a break of some description, or you need to have a qualitative shift in the level of your ideas, and then you need to move into the final part, the final epoch of history. And at least in Hegel's system, this was called speculative idealism. Marx, he declares that his entire system is materialist, and so that's how he avoids the speculative idealist aspect. But in terms of the actual conjuration of ideas, the speculative nature of it, not really requiring any kind of objective testing or anything like this, well, it's actually largely indistinguishable from Hegel's system. It's just the actual contents are different. The form of the philosophy and its progression is largely the same. So you'll always have one set of ideas, and then you'll be looking to mediate a change into a different set of ideas. You might make a development in a certain area. Say, for example, you invent some sort of piece of technology by some breakthrough. You then feed that all the way back through the system of ideas, through that process of reflection, and it leads to a cascade which changes all of the ideas that you have, and then ideally moves people towards the new historicist end. This is just the demonstration of what we've been talking about. So one of the key things in Hegel, and certainly in Marx's philosophy, is that there's a change in the form of logic used, and this change in the form of logic is correlated with a change in the entire form and conception of reality. So you move from one into the other, and today we would certainly in the present day we'd be very familiar with things like analytical reason, so the scientific methodology, or you'd maintain a distinction between different people or different objects. That would come quite naturally. You see yourself as distinct from a glass, you see yourself as distinct from other people, although there is of course different means of connection when you're in a community. But the point here is that the form of reason itself shifts with history, and in Marx's system, as it's also in Hegel's system, is you need to start adopting very certain ideas, and one in which is the historicism, which is the progress, and you break from the old form of reason, which is you reject the law of identity, so you reject seeing yourself as distinct from other objects or other people, and then you begin to see yourself as part of this monad. Is an important concept, whether in Hegel's philosophy or whether in Marx's philosophy. And a monad is essentially a universal substance. In Hegel, it's more of a universal conception under which all concepts and ideas in philosophy are nested. When Marx materializes Hegel's system, then you end up with a monadology, but of being and existence itself. So you see that there's this principle of non-contradiction between all things on the level of being. It's a circular system. It's self-referential. It's kind of like in, for example, if Moses goes to the burning bush and God says, I am that I am. It's this encompassing of all. It's self-referential. There's no other real reference to use once you are at the origin, and you've got that same kind of system here in Marx, but the monadology ends up comprising nature and humanity instead. So one of the things that's important in this movement is overcoming the old form of reason. So that's the analytical reason. So you need to come to this awareness in your consciousness. So there's a break between the old way that you reason and you semantically organize the information in the world around you. You break that, by coming to awareness, and then you move into a new phase. And one of the important characteristics of this new phase is there's a principle of non-contradiction. So you can imagine that in the world, there's all of the different objects, glasses, people, dogs, cats, whatever the hell it happens to be, but they're distinct from one another. Whereas if you're coming at it from a monadological perspective, you're trying to see how there's some aspect of being which is through and interconnected with all of those different things. So there's an aspect of being which is in a dog, in a glass, in a cat, in a person, in another person. So you've got this concept of diversity, but there's something which is one and which unites them all through there. And in Marxism, contradiction is a problem. You want to overcome contradictions. So whilst contradictions are useful because they realize knowledge and they realize differences, for the Marxist, they're largely a signpost for two things which need to be crashed together in order that some sort of new transmutation can take place. So one of the important ideas when you're moving from two to one, which is always, essentially what you're trying to do in the advance towards the Marxist monad, is that you're trying to shed degrees of difference. You're essentially losing degrees of freedom, and you are obtaining greater certainty and greater solidarity between things. And what I mean by that is that you're shedding the contradictions, the differential aspect of different things, and you're trying to bring them all into connection. So you're synthesizing, you're transmuting, you're sublimating differences, you're bringing things together, and you get rid of the things which are contradictory between them, and then you preserve or you summon out some sort of thing which is in common. So you can kind of think of it, well, this is alchemy, the idea that you turn lead into gold. You're trying to, apply something to the lead, the form of reason to the lead, and then you're meant to obtain something from that lead. It's meant to turn into gold. Essentially the same principle here. Now, when we come to Marx's ideas, he has a certain process which he follows, which is that the physical world is reflected in our consciousness. And all he's really meaning at that point is that there are events or actions that you can perform in the world, and then you can also represent those actions, those events, with a category and a concept. So the idea is that something in the physical world is reflected in your consciousness. So you can see that whilst, on the one hand, your consciousness, as far as Hegel's concerned, can reflect ideas out of it, there's a means in which they are also reflections of the material world around us, as far as Marx is concerned. So, you can perform an act of labor, so you might be building a shed, and you hammer nails into a bit of wood and it's going to build a structure up, and then you're going to put walls on it and things. And then on top of that, there's going to be a ideal or an idea-based representation of all of those actions. So that's their reflection up. And Marx has got a consistent theory for all productive effort, and that's his theory of labor. And that has a whole host of moral and aesthetic and other value judgments associated with it. But what's quite useful about the using the wagon wheel as a kind of representation is that it's useful to show the connection between all of the different aspects of life. So you can have the material world is one aspect, but then a collective of people is in one country is one aspect. All collectives of people is a different aspect. Individuals are a different aspect. The institutions and the ideas that people have, or the things that the actions that people perform, these are all different kinds of aspects which are all interrelated with one another and which influence one another. So naturally, when you're moving from the analytical form of reason, the law of identities, from a non-historicist conception of the world, and you're moving to a dialectical conception of the world where you reject the law of identities, where you have a historicist system, where you say that all ideas are reflected in one another and that they actually have a purpose, that they're oriented towards this goal, the monad, at the end of Hegel or Marxist history, then you're going to change the way that you conceive of ideas. And one of the key ways is to read that subject-object split into all aspects of life, which have heretofore existed. So what that means, if you're a Marxist theoretician or if you're a dialectical theoretician who's later in the same tradition, is you go back and you remap all of existence. You don't allow it to stand as it previously has existed. You inherit the world and all of the conceptions of it, and what you need to do is see yourself remaking and refashioning it all in some sort of guise of your image. And so one of the first places where Marx does that are with private property and labour, which are inherently linked with one another. So if you're going to create some sort of object, you need to put effort in. You're going to need to perhaps use tools. Those are also objects. So there's this dual aspect of private property, which he parses out between the subjective and the objective. The subjective is the labour, your life spent. That's true across every level and across every type of labour. And then you've got different types or different levels of objects of labour. So that can be, the material, that's you shoveling something into a coal furnace. It's you building something. It's you mining. But likewise, it could be more abstract. You could be doing abstract labour, such as scientific research and investigation. And you also have other kind of abstract objects which affect the economy. So that's things like currency and wealth, and these are all interconnected with one another. So you're starting to see how he's got this entire system which is all interconnected and self-referential, and if you want to depose it, if you want to get rid of it, you need to start chipping away and break one part, but you need to level out the whole thing. If you're going to remake and refashion the entirety of existence, then you're going to need to disrupt all of the previous ideas that people have held. And one of the things which makes me somewhat reluctant to say that the material is always completely a priori in Marx's system is that he does have a line in his I think it's Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Start of the German Ideology. In the preface, he speaks about how, the kind of revolutionaries he wants are the people who will deny gravity so as to walk on water. So it's this kind of, this mentalism which affects the nature of reality and the physical laws and all of the qualities which influence and govern the way we live our lives. So in Marxism, you've really got this idea of, kind of mentalism first, even though it's materialist. So I'm just going to walk through, again, some, an image to try and emphasize how there's a break from one time to another. So you can see that here, you or I, we are living in a world where we use the subject-object split, different kind of reason. And so we would look at things like work, tools, private property. We all consider them as separate entities. Marx has his different form of reason, so he's going to conceive of all of those same things, but through a different lens. Fetishism is what he ascribes our system as. He believes that we see these erroneously as separate from ourselves, and that this is used in order to goad people into the same system of power. So he is using his form of reason to reinterpret all of the world as you see it, and then he's going to simply label the way that you see the world is false, it's a lie, it's all completely erroneous, it's being used to subdue you into perpetuating that system. What you need to do is go with Marx. Marx has got the free, real interpretation of reality. You need to trust him and go with him. So essentially what he's saying is that when you adopt the same form of reason through your parents teaching it to you in the family, through schooling, and you go into the same system of work and labor, you're actually perpetuating a system of subject-object split, which is false. It's actually subject-object union, but because you're not recognizing this intrinsic feature of reality, which is that there's an alternative form of reason with which you should conceive the world if it's to be legitimate, then you're going to perpetuate that old system. So you need to break out of it. And of course, all forms of the subjectivism are interconnected with one another. So if you've got the very form of reason, the very ideas by which people then conduct work, then it's going to influence the objects and tools they use to partake in work. So it's going to influence the products of their labor. So that's their remuneration in terms of pay, and then in terms of private property that they can then accrue and spend their remuneration on. So the whole idea is that the false form of reason sustains the false form of reality. But Karl Marx is here beyond the break, capable, basically attributes to himself the ability and insight to reconceive of the world from a different perspective, and that his is higher, this is the truth, this is what people need to consider and adopt. So if we just kind of refresh on that, the idea is that there's historicism and the subject-object collapse, and that extends to private property. And so we see Marx saying the product of labour as an alien object exercising power over him. So now you can start to see how, when you conceive of the object as separate from yourself, there's, in Marx's view, some sort of power that it then wields. It's kind of like this, like a chanter in front of a snake or something. It's playing this song, it's enchanting. You're kind of fascinated with it. And then this is used in order to basically goad people into reperpetuating that entire system. And so he says later on that the fetish is imbued with, quote, supernatural creative power through labour. So what you're seeing here is that when something is seen as an object, when it's seen as something separate, other people can do something to imbue it with their desires, with their characters. This is really where the word fetish is coming from, is the kind of the spiritual notion that you'd expect to see in primitive societies, where there's some sort of kind of wood, material, matter fetish that's being created, and that's kind of a conduit to some aspect of divine nature which the primitive is communing with, and they're perhaps praying to or asking or looking to supplicate with offerings and things like this. Well, Marx is essentially attributing the same thing to capitalism, to the system of private property and work, which he calls labour. So if you were going to your job, then the idea is that your manager, your boss, society, they are all partaking in this kind of this system which props up an erroneous view of what these separate objects are. But what's taking place consciously or unconsciously is that every individual is imbuing these external objects, these fetishes, with supernatural creative power, and that creative power is to induce you into using the same form of logic and to partake in the same system of labour. So it's this, so everything's given up in this kind of sacrifice to those objects, and it induces other people to continue that same habit of sacrifice. It induces people to prop up the same system. So it is described as a system of sacrifice in which those dominant and with reproductive access steal the essence from those lower in the hierarchy. That is a summation of Marx's system of labour. That's the way he looks at the labour and private property as it takes part in society, as it takes place in society. And the key ideas he has governing this are alienation and estrangement. So alienation is more of a transcendental idea. It's more associated with religion and philosophy. So, for example, alienation is in God. Alienation is in Hegelian philosophy. What you need to do is adopt Marx's ideas and Marx's system instead to undo the alienation. So you can see that as you're moving from the old system across the break to the new system, there is this slow shedding of alienation where you're becoming less transcendental, less religious, less philosophical, and more materialist. And of course, the form of alienation has a governing role because that gets you to maintain looking at the law of identities, the subject-object split. That gets you to partake in the whole system of supernatural creative power, which sacrifices people's essence. It's a system of human sacrifice. Well, that means that you're then estranged from the objects. You see it as separate from yourself. So the labor that you partake in, the means of labor, so that'd be things like tools and raw materials, the modes of labor, so that would be, like different vocations, where you could be a tradesman, a lawyer, a legislator, a doctor, a philosopher. These are all underpinned by estrangement once you've got the wrong form of reason. So naturally you need to undo alienation, undo the wrong form of reason. This will allow you to undo estrangement, and then you can recapitulate all of life, but now with the correct orientation to all of life. So he maintains that fetishism is one of the key things which is helping to perpetuate the estrangement. So you need to break the fetish in order to, as part of breaking the estrangement, as part of breaking the alienation. So you can see that how, at least in the way that Marxists and dialecticians view the world, is that everything is essentially connected together as this whole self-sustaining system, and that's because their way of looking at the world uses circular logic. So everything is self-reinforcing, self-sustaining. So you need to break everything at the exact same time. You need to have revolution in the form of logic, in the knowledge, in the ways in which people conduct themselves, in the prevailing ideas in society, in the institutions, and so on and so forth. So it's a revolution in every facet of every degree of life that needs to take place in order to break from the old epoch of history and to move into the new epoch of history. And so one of the key ones here is to change the form of reason itself, and really what that means to do is to make people less objective, to make them more subjective, more emotional, more open to emotional appeals. And fundamentally in Marxism, you do that by driving through the sense of victimhood. So that's the idea here, which is, a system of sacrifice in which those dominant and with reproductive access steal the essence from those lower in the hierarchy. So you look at the world, you look at the economy as a zero-sum game of exploitation and oppression in which people have been destroyed, and people who have anything have only gotten those gains by taking it and stealing it from other people. So it's all a system of human sacrifice. And this victimhood and sacrifice is used to induce a huge amount of anger in people in order to get them to overthrow their existing society. Only something as fundamental as that is going to be strong enough to convince people to kill their own families, to sell their own children into slavery, as took place in Soviet Russia. So Marx does have a conception of good and evil, and this is something which is very easy to miss, but it's rooted in, quote, an actual economic fact. So you can imagine that if you're told that everything that you have ever understood about life, existence, the work you do, is all an entire lie. It's actually been specifically cultivated in order to maintain you in your position of slavery, so that your life essence can be extracted from you, so that other people can capitalize on it, benefit from it, who can live comfortable lives, have happier, healthier spouses and families. Then this has incredible moral implications. And once you start to label the entire system as human sacrifice, it's not necessarily he does use the language of Moloch, and so he is referencing, the biblical form of sacrifice. If you're rejecting the idea of God, then really what's taking place is a human sacrifice to other humans. It's not necessarily a theological function, but it's certainly a sociological and economic one. I argue in my book that it is actually a theological one because of the monad at the end of Marx's history and what he does with that in relation to God, but that's not necessarily what we're focusing on today. So yeah, he says that the economy functions well enough to perpetuate slavery. It is forced labor, self-sacrifice, mortification. So every act that you perform under the this economy as it exists, with alienation, the wrong form of logic, with estrangement, this is with every hammer blow, with every act. It's a system of you're sacrificing your own life. It's actually speeding your own death, but it's being vampirically leached by other people who own more private property than you, and then you, because you've been goaded into this system through fetishism and believing in the supernatural powers that have been imbued in it, you have now started to set up goals where you want more private property. You believe that you can cultivate skill, that you can become proficient in your vocation, and that you can be rewarded for it. And these are, for Marx, all complete deceits. These are actually just tools, more sophisticated tools, to get you to buy into the system and to not throw it off and remove it. So the more objects the worker produces, the fewer he can possess, and the more he falls under the dominion of his product. So here's the idea that there's a limited amount of resources in the world. So the more that you act and create, the more you've actually stripped away from that. The harder you work, the less there is. The more you produce, the poorer you are. The more skilled you are in your vocation, the greater you have sacrificed your life to the lie. So in every way, you can invert the world as it is, and you can come to the ideas of Marx and Marxism. So what you could do as a fairly straightforward way of coming up with some Marxist developments is basically just take everything that you thought was good, or take everything that you thought was evil, and flip it on its head, but tie it towards the known goal that you want to get to in terms of Marxism. So that you want to make the entire system as it exists evil, and you want to make all of Marx's system sound good. And so you can divvy up the way that you're going to interpret all information in terms of that, crude moral score sheet. So the world is a domain for action. Every action that you take can have a correct orientation. You can do things in the right way. You can do them with skill and consciousness, or you can do them with unconsciousness and with a lack of skill, a lack of clarity. And in Marx's system, that would be believing in Christ. He really dislikes Christ and God. His system is largely the inversion of that. What you can do is take each of these different things and then you flip them on their head. So, it's not just that in the existing system in which you go to work and so on and so forth, where you labor, you can actually never succeed in that system, because even when you succeed, you've actually just become the greatest failure, because you were more taken in by the deceitful ideas, and you're actually the most evil person because you are perpetuating other people. You're a false idol, perpetuating or inducing others to buy into the same system. You are getting you're a Pied Piper, leading other people's astray. So even the things that you create when you're like a hobby, whatever that happened to be, either doing the hobby or creating some sort of thing which is the hobby, those would all be underpinned by estrangement. And so again, it's all perpetuating the system of sacrifice and slavery. So even when you're trying to enjoy yourself, when you look upon things which are beautiful, whether it's a piece of art or a great piece of architecture, not modern architecture, because obviously it's a complete travesty, it's disgusting, but when you look at, for something like, whether it's like, the Greek Parthenon, or whether you're looking at an old piece of art, these are all still things which are underpinned by labor and Marxist system. They're actually all ugly. And so what you need to do when you believe that, there's a limited number of objects in the world, and that as labor is used to reform them, that it robs the entire totality of substance of some minor aspect of itself. what you need to do is you need to go back and you need to destroy all previous human creations in order to re-release the material which can then be used for communist and Marxist labor. So you need to destroy everything in existence in order to then remake it, and it's to remake it in your image, with your hand, with your influence, with the correct ideas, with the correct view of the reality, and so on and so forth. So yeah, in the old system, the harder you work, the poorer you are. The more you create, the more deprived you are. The more you achieve, the more defeated you are. Whereas if you go through Marxist system, you can you gain special alchemical insight into the nature of reality. You need to take all of the things that have previously been established. You apply your dialectical philosopher's stone to it, and you come up with these new random insights. These are deemed scientific, but it's only scientific in the sense that it's gone through a specific system and a specific stepwise processes, such as to make it more emotional, to make it to read victimhood into it, and then you need to reform all of existence in line with those ideas. But this isn't just a one-off thing; this is a continual thing. So alienation and estrangement cascade to individuals and relations, and the important thing to recognize in Marx's system is that once everything is a reflection of, or the ideas in your consciousness are a reflection of what's taking place in the material world, you've got material relations between different groups or between different groups and nature, and these are likewise reflected in your consciousness. So the subjective aspect is that you're an individual, you can be a member of a group, and you've got a relationship with your group. You've got a relationship even with groups you're not members of. Your group or not groups will have various relations between them, and these can all be represented in or reflected up into consciousness, and then there's ideas of you'd hold of them. So likewise, when you've got the moral domain in Marxism, which is the economy and labour, then the subjective essence of labour is always constant throughout. There's always a human element which is involved, even if it's a human element which is being read out through the development of machinery. It still at some point in the system takes human labour to develop these tools and machines. But you've always got the objective, which is the kind of the free floating, which can take different manifestations. So the object of labour is turned into the objectification of man's species life. And so what's taking place here is that when you subjectively act, not only are you robbing yourself and your immediate family and so on and so forth, you're actually robbing all of humanity as a species of adopting the subject-object collapse form of logic and being aware of the monad at the end of history and of striving towards that. So the object of labour is turned into the objectification of man's species life. So you're actually seeing the species as something separate from yourself. You're seeing a contradiction arise between you and your collective, and it's this contradiction which obviously as far as Marx is concerned, which makes it easy for you to then persecute other people. So the different levels of objectification of man's species life, they're going to have different expressions. It kind of boomerangs and comes back to objectify the person. So where I objectify other people, they likewise objectify me. This makes it easier to exploit them. This helps to perpetuate the oppressive social relations and the victimhood between us. This is why there's the false form of reason, yada, 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 and it all sustains itself. So you've got wealth, so that would be one particular form of labour. So you could get wealth from cultivating agriculture, you could get wealth from mining, and various other types of trade. So it's a particular manifestation of the objectification now finding its way into material coinage and having a certain value on it. But then there's this more kind of governing aspect, and that's the capital. So wealth is just the particular manifestations of the overarching monad at this point, which is the capital. The capital is the abstract labor, and it reaches almost all. It's the kind of the principle by which all the other forms of wealth come to be. It reaches through them. It's got the same kind of cruel, cynical, human sacrifice-inducing aspect of it. And so when you're performing your labor, what you do is you're taking this raw nature, you're combining it with your essence, and then you're giving it away into capital, and then you're also, by the same token, sustaining the system of fetishism, which is reproducing the capital, which is reproducing the labor, so on and so forth. So you can see how all of this essentially blends together into this horrendous melange, and it's very difficult to see, a way out of it. And so when you're performing these kind of intellectual exercises, the intent is to make all of the issues massively interconnected, but interconnected in a way which is so dense and impossible to solve that the conclusion then becomes to, all right, well, we've just got to basically wipe the slate clean and start again. And that is deliberate, because it's not actually looking for a technologically informed, a scientifically informed way of improving the world around us. It's trying to induce people into seeing their sacrifice, and to then reject society as it is by throwing off through revolution, violent revolution in particular. The linchpin is quite clearly a function of the form of consciousness, and most clearly it's a function of the form of logic. So if you hold an Aristotelian or even Hegelian form of logic, then as far as Marx is concerned, that's perpetuating evil. And so you can see that if you've got a certain type of civilization which arises based on the wrong form of logic, then you need to destroy that, break it apart, and then build the revolutionary society. So that's is always find the victimhood and to try and constitute the proletariat in order to affect the revolution. And so you're always looking at life as a diversity of relations. This wagon wheel, you associate all of the different things, they're reflecting one another. And what you're then attempting to do is to synthesize them together. And this synthesis, like the alchemical philosopher's stone, it gives you special insight, or some sort of special kind of mental transmutation is taking place. And this is seen as being associated with, the sublimation out, the sublation out of genuine knowledge. It's got some special insight into the entity or the monad that's at the end of history. So by using the dialectical methodology, you get special insight into this, and then this basically places you as a kind of wizard, dialectical wizard, who they can say this to other people, and this should induce them to change. So you constitute these entirely new arbitrary systems. You trick people into adopting it, and then they basically go about murdering, all of their local society. And the only way you can achieve that is by using that framing of human sacrifice in order to make people angry enough to throw off their existing society, to enslave or kill their family, as communists are quite content to do when we look back on Soviet Russia or communist China or Cambodia, and indeed anywhere else the communists will get power. It's just one of the things, it's their shtick. So naturally, if you're going to completely reform all of reality, then you're going to need to have dialectical equivalents for all of the conceptions and major aspects of life which have heretofore existed. And so obviously, reason is replaced with dialectical reason. Having a world in which, you've got the material world, but there might also be the transcendental, so that's the divine, the religious. You replace that with materialism. You have God, who you negate with atheism. And then in turn, if you're going to negate God with atheism, you're going to also need to negate the form of religion. You're going to need to try and get rid of all of the you can't have all the churches and everything go and just write on a bit of paper, okay, and cross out God. That's not going to be enough. You need to get rid of the actual institutions where ideas on God and moral instruction are conveyed to the people. And then you're going to need to replace them with something else. So you've got negative humanism, which is the realization that the church is basically just false. It's a place of lies and deceit. The real moral ground is where you are partaking in work. So that's the labor aspect. And then the positive humanism is, the correct orientation. That's the correct moral location for your work. And in Marxism, it's actually the production of the correct form of goods in the correct way, using the correct means. That's the new moral system. So obviously, if anything which has been touched by old labour and old methods, that's to be smashed and destroyed, and then needs to be replaced. So you need to level all of the churches and then build something else, presumably factories, and then replace everything thereby. And then you're going to obviously need a different moral teaching. So, God is replaced by humanity in Marx's system. God, as far as, arguably this starts with Hegel, but Feuerbach certainly attributes it to Hegel, which is that, God is a psychological projection. So God is derivative of man. And if that's the case, then really all there is humanity and their mental aspect, their way of framing the world. So certain people see the world with God or religion or Buddhism or whatever it happens to be. Those people, as far as Marxism are concerned, are defective and need to be destroyed. And so you either you present them the ideas, which is the atheism, and if they don't respond to the atheism, then they're put to the sword. So naturally, if you're going to remove all of these different moral and institutional and societal crutches and the ways of looking at reality, then you're also going to end up negating Marx's creations. So these are the rhetorical descriptions and concepts he's developed to reinterpret people, for people to use to reinterpret the world around them. Specifically, they're all subject-object collapse. So, you can use every single one of these to recognize your victimhood and how you've been destroyed and oppressed. And that is to goad you into being in a frame of mind where you're ready to kill your family. And so we get rid of all of those old concepts, and you get rid of all those old concepts primarily by destroying the people who hold those concepts and who have been propping up that system. So if your family don't join you as part of the crusade, then you need to destroy them, and that's baked in very fundamentally into Marx's philosophy, because as far as he's concerned, the family is the place where private property and oppression begin. So the husband enslaves the wife and forces her to have children who then partake in the fetishism and perpetuate the private property and so on and so forth. So they're all slaves. And of course, this system makes it nice and straightforward for you to destroy your family. And of course, you replace the family with the species. So the big thing in the Marxist system is that you're not really looking at yourself as an individual anymore. You're just a cog in a machine. So you are really trying to reattune yourself to the needs of the species. So you are supposed to change or to adopt new collectivist senses, and you're attending to information in different ways now. You're supposed to look out for things which are, good for the species versus things which are bad. So you're trying to take a depersonalized approach to yourself and to other people. Of course, this is specifically designed to make the whole murdering other people thing much easier, because you're not really looking at them as an individual who has inherent value. You're trying to look at them in terms of do they stack up on the right side doing the right thing, or do they not? And if they don't stack up on the right side doing the right thing, then you need to remove them. And the indicator that you use in order to determine whether they need to be churned into the ground or whether they get to live and be part of the murderous proletariat is their response to hearing the Promethean fire of Marx's word. So if they respond to it in the correct way, they have their consciousness raised and they go like, I've seen the light, then they're okay. They're one of us. They're part of the species. as they get to survive. But if not, then yeah, you get to do them in. So you get to experience all of the worst aspects of yourself, kind of just let loose for revenge and resentment, and you get to visit it on other people without any guilt. So the human body itself becomes a very important part of the revolution. You know, it's essentially considered part of the material which is constituting this third subject at the end of history, the monad, the conscious living humanity, nature, which is at the end of Marx's system. You know, your body's actual is a particular embodiment of this overall collective entity. And a really useful picture for conceptualizing this is if you've ever looked at the front of Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, there's an image of a land, and over the land is this immense being, the Leviathan, which is this monarch, and embodied or in the monarch is constituted by all of these individual little people, and so you've got this idea of diversity in one together. But it's a very useful image for considering the end of history as far as, you know, the Marxists are concerned. So you've got the species element, and you're now preserving essentially the new formation of material divinity. So any piece of damage to any body of the Marxist collective is essentially an attack on their form of divinity. So the new form of reason, because of the dialectical nature and because of the historicist nature, you've got a certain break in the epoch, and the first break is the consciousness raising. So you hear the Promethean fire of Marx's word and his new rhetorical creations. This raises your consciousness, but the problem that you're in is that you're still alienated. So you can perceive a higher future, but you are basically weighed back by, you know, your existing family, your existing friends, the existing society, the ideas that you used to hold, the way that the institutions were previously developed, the way that you partake in work through labor, you're possessing private property. These are all sustaining your alienation. All of the ideas in society, ideology, these are what are forcing you to perpetuate this. And so you need to instead use this knowledge to posit a new future and to find new ways to destroy the existing society. And you really see, whether it's particularly in the writings of Engels, is the murderous nature of it. So you've got his main thing was to make violence the midwife of the revolution, I heard it called somewhere. And so you always see in Engels things like Vae Victis, which is woe to the vanquished. There's another line he had, which was, you know, the only way that the bloody birth throes of the revolution can be shortened are through revolutionary terror. So terror is a specific tool. For that, it looked like Marx and Engels were leaning on Louis de Saint-Just, if you're aware of that figure. He was the archangel of terror during the French Revolution, so they were looking at him for inspiration. And so you've got a lot of imagery in Engels, which is, you know, looking towards violence. And so there's a woman called Diane Paul, which had a 1981 paper called Marxist Views of Race and Culture, and she's got a quotation of Engels where he's saying, "The chief mission of all the other races and peoples, large and small, is to perish in the revolutionary Holocaust." So you can see there's, you know, quite an early use of the word Holocaust there. But as far as the Marxists were concerned, everyone's job, if they didn't survive or join the Marxist Revolutionary Collective, was to die. Now, there's a neat trick there as well, which you should recognize, is that the proletariat, they have a foot in both domains. So the proletariat are still tarred, if you will, by alienation and estrangement. You know, they've got this black goo on them. And the idea is that through successive revolutions, you know, they can kind of scrub it away slowly. But one of the important things to recognize with the proletariat is their job is to destroy the old society, but also in the process destroy themselves. So this idea of the alchemical transformation of lead into gold it's this kind of this repeated procedure. It's also embodied. So you have the proletariat. They destroy the existing society. They kill themselves in the process. So there's immense bloodshed. But then once this new norm is established, in order to, because the entire system of reason is dialectical, then the entire process begins again. So it's just this continual revolution of persecution and murder, which is just unending until, eventually they kind of, the Marxists step back and think, oh Christ, we've really done a number on this one. And it even gives them pause for thought. And that took until Khrushchev in Soviet Russia, and obviously in China, they were happy to murder loads of people as well. So there's really is this built-in aspect of human sacrifice. It's structured in at the fundamental level of Marxism. It's a feature of the thought. That's the alchemical aspect when you're applying it to the people. But in order to induce people into doing that, you need to tell them that, this has already been done to them. So this is the mirror politics, which induces people into human sacrifice. Now, 2.7, so you eventually move towards the collapse of all distinction. So you've still got that alchemical process going on. And you've got human history, but then you've also got natural history. And what you want to try and do is bring these two things together. And that's the kind of one of the final syntheses, which is to constitute the Marxist monad. So you unite humanity and nature dialectically, and you create this thing called the species being. So species being is very encompassing. It denotes how it's, humanity at the level of the species, but it kind of also denotes how there's kind of a lessening that takes place, and that reflects the fact that, there's not the same moral guidance. People aren't living by deontological ethics or the Ten Commandments anymore. It's everything that's just subjectively populated by Marx's system. So you've got the species aspect. It's all very materialistic. It's dialectical. They don't really have a problem with murdering people. In fact, it's required. It's part of the purification process, is always killing. And then you've got the being aspect. So the being is all of being itself. So that's the entirety of all of the material world and the universe. And then, of course, the species being itself has got kind of like this active aspect, which is the labor of the species and being together, reforming itself from itself for itself. So it's kind of your rubric. And you can see these ideas repeated elsewhere in their philosophy. So you take the collective of nature. It really comes from Hegel. You've got the kind of substance and living substance in Hegel, and he's also got his monadism, but you can also see it extend into the ideas of Georges Bataille. So kind of when I was saying about how, the image of Hobbes and the Leviathan is quite useful, is also that essentially appears explicitly in Georges Bataille, where the task of the person is to embody the collective in their psychology. And so Georges Bataille is asking you to, if you're a Marxist, is to displace your individuality with all of the possibilities of the species in your own psychology, and to be a collectivist within your own mind. And he's not entirely clear on, how this happens, but he's saying like, well, that's the objective that you want to go for. And so you can kind of see how this system, once it's implemented, leads to an immense collapse of contradictions, which have real consequences for us and our lives. If you collapse the contradiction between the moral teachings that we have and the natural world, so that we function at species level, then you essentially get rid of a lot of the morality that we have. You've definitely dispensed with the idea that people have inherent value, because you're saying, well, actually, you're just an expression of the species. So if you need to be killed, well, you're unlucky. Everyone just kind of hopes that they're on the right side of the killing when it comes to Marxism. And so once you then extend that to a lot of the developments that are after Marxism, so with the people like the post-structuralists, the postmodernists, you start to see, for example, in Derrida, the idea of divine animality. So he's got numerous discourses in The Beast and the Sovereign, Volume 1. One of the sermons he's got in that talks about how the snake is the friend. So the snake in the Garden of Eden is your friend. It was wrong that he was cast out and God had done something cruel. And so when you've got this idea that the animal is the source of special knowledge, and you kind of reject the ideas of objective knowledge and science and scientific development like the post-structuralists do, you end up having the, crashing down the animal into the human in a very fundamental way when we're now talking about things like species. And so with post-humanity and kin, which you see in Derrida and Braidotti and Haraway's philosophy, is you're actually removing moral distinction. So you're reviving a different way to murder other people, but it's because you're saying, well, there's not actually any kind of proper moral ground. It's just people are acting in line with the species, and if it's my nature to kill the things around me, then so be it. Tough tits for everyone around. And then, of course, you can have, if you're in the more kind of some of the more hermetic or the Gnostic aspects, then you might argue that all of the material in the world, or all of the substances, kind of have a major and a minor, or a male and a female aspect. And you can kind of see this read throughout Marx's philosophy when it comes to oppression. So oppression is that kind of the cruel male aspect, and then the woman is the feminine, the victim, the good aspect. And it's got that kind of crude moral division through the black and white lens. And then it says, okay, well, these two things are opposites. Now what you need to do is to alchemically synthesize them together and then come up with a new norm. So, you can see that with, humans and the species. You get rid of the individuals, everyone becomes a member of the collective. When it comes to the postmodernists, then you've got the collapse of distinction between the man and the animal, and that's because then you get rid of morality that way. And then in queer theory, for example, you get rid of the distinction between man and woman, and you do that by rejecting sex and biology, and you frame them as discourses. That's what Foucault does. And likewise, if you get rid of all of these things like the difference between what's legal and illegal, then you also get the other developments that you have in queer theory, which is to try and legalize pederasty. So you can see how all of these ideas, of removing contradictions are a way of basically re-simplifying life, removing moral and legal restrictions on people's behavior so that people can really get in tune with the worst aspects of their nature. So it's worth touching a little bit more on the species being, given its relation to the proletariat, and given that the proletariat can take different forms. Obviously, in Marxism, the proletariat is primarily economic, but post-Marx, it doesn't necessarily need to be economic. So you can have sexual proletariat, you can have racial proletariat, you can have a divine proletariat. You're going to start to see those kind of things crop up a lot more. But each of these filter in different ways in towards the species being, or maybe different manifestations of the species being. Now we're going to revisit the monad with some quotes. Now I typically call this humanity nature, often instead of the species being, just to try and make the conjunction between humanity as a species and nature itself a bit more clear, rather than using Marx's own term, which is species being. But I also use the italicization of the letters to try and demonstrate also where he's using the technical aspect or the dialectically reformed aspect of the concept. But that doesn't necessarily mean I go back and italicize the different quotes where it's being referred to in that. So essentially the image is always going to have two phases. So you've got the wrong form of reason, you have the break with the consciousness raising, you're aware that there's a different form of dialectical reason, and then you go through the sequence of always trying to synthesize things together. So you've always got this movement which is critique, and so you take the existing world as it is and you try to just attack it, and the attack is finding the contradictions, finding the emotional aspects, finding the victimhood, trying to tear all of these different ideas down or to render them into their lowest and their basest forms. And what this, through the act of critiquing, you're going to stumble across something, whereas, oh yeah, it's like this instead. So you're going through the critique, and then through this act of critique, you develop theories, and then the theories inform how you're next going to critique and break things apart. So a theory might also involve, a dialectical synthesis between thing A and thing B, and then you develop a new theory about, these other aspects. So say, for example, in Foucault, the revolution's not going great by the 70s. There's all of the evidence of all the murdering and things like that. That's not too good for PR. So what you want to do is you want to try and shift the ground. And so he kind of takes Gramsci's ideas and then says, okay, well, you've got all of these things that are communicated in culture. So really what we're talking about is discourses. And so you're parsing out a very subtle aspect, and then you reread all of the philosophy down into this new subtle aspect that you've developed through the contradiction, through the critique. So you resituate everything as a discourse, and broadly that is Foucault's philosophy. So I've got lectures about that's in lecture number 2, I think, in the development of queer theory, if you're interested in that one. So anyway, you're going through this process of critiquing everything. You develop a new theory. The new theory needs to be dialectical and historicist. It's moving you towards that end of history. It's moving you towards the Marxist monad. And then you need to essentially just hammer at that continuously. And it's always important that once you've developed a theory, you're putting it into practice. So critique is revolutionary action in Marxism. And what you'll often find is, if there's a Marxist who does a bunch of developments and they don't say, hey guys, this is the thing that you need to destroy. They all bleat about it and moan that the person's an idealist, and you can kind of see that in the reviews of Lukács's work. He wasn't clear enough to his fellow comrades as like, hey guys, this is the thing that you need to trash. He was too abstract, too intelligent for them. So anyway, you've got the monadological aspect come through when you start to see sentences like, in hearing, nature hears itself. Well, when you're reading Marxist philosophy, you need to always be taking the frame, or being able to hold within your mind that a word is going to have two meanings. And that's because of the historicist aspect and the dialectical aspect. So you're reforming all of reality. So the lexicon, the ideas, the reason, everything that you're associated, typically familiar with using, these all need to be reformed. And if that's the case, then nature has one meaning, and then nature has a different meaning. And this is a useful way of parsing out how the hermetic aspect of the philosophy is that you need to be in the know in order to understand it. Unless you've done the work, you're going to find it very hard to actually grasp the stylistic barrier to entry when it comes to Marxist, post-structuralist, and postmodern philosophy. And so this is me basically just giving it to you right here, is every word is going to have two meanings, and it's recognizing that they are divorced by the historicist aspect. So you can see here, in hearing, nature hears itself. It's a bit of a weird sentence, but it's because you, as an individual, if you're a member of the species, your nature hearing itself. So it's taking a different perspective. It's taking, you got to get good at recognizing these perspectives, but you can only do that with practice. So human sensuousness is therefore the medium in which natural processes are reflected. So it's that aspect that nature is reflecting some aspect of itself into us as humans, and then we as humans as the species with the highest faculties, can do something special with that information. And for Marx, that's being the caretaker, living in harmony with nature to some degree, but under his system of communism, where humanity is taking from itself, creating from itself, for itself. So nature is man's inorganic body. Physical and spiritual life is linked to nature. It's a common term that you get in the 1800s and throughout a lot of 19th century writings. You see a lot of this idea of inorganic nature and organic nature. It's just the distinction between, in Hegel, which is living substance, so that would be things like people and animals, whereas the inorganic is more kind of like the inanimate objects, like trees and leaves and stuff. So you've got these two things, but nonetheless, there's a kind of an exchange between the two, and you see this more in Engels' philosophy, because you still need to consume objects which ultimately come from, grass, sunlight, and the natural world. So you take aspects of the here inorganic, and you ingest them, and it becomes part of the organic. But for Marx, it's quite a fundamental union. He's saying here that physical and spiritual life is linked to nature. That's a very strange way of saying things for somebody who wants to get rid of God and who wants to get rid of religion. The idea that there is a physical and spiritual life sustained would be, at least when I would have first opened up a book on Marx, with the atheism and things like that, that would have been rather antithetical. But once you have the key to the end of Marx's system, which is the monadology and the process of sacrificing people and all of society and all ideas and reforming them in order to get towards the end of history, that monad, it actually becomes very clear there is still a specific spiritual aspect in that, and that is that humanity is God in its union with nature. That's why he says, man is the supreme being of man. And that, in order for humanity to exist, God has to die. So he is nature. So you've got this aspect of, being one and the same as nature. And then society is another one of these terms that he uses to encapsulate how once you've got the correct orientation between you, the collective, and nature, that's where you've got that's the new society. So that's going to inform your consciousness, your ideas. That's the socialist construction. So society is the consummated oneness in substance of man and nature brought to fulfillment. That's your monad, right there. That's what that means. And the important thing to recall is that the monad, right from Hegel's philosophy, is it's a process. So you enter an end state, but the end state itself is transformation. So the only constant is change, is the way of kind of looking at it. And so once you step into, you get past all the murdering and stuff like this, and you get into the final stage of history, you end up in the monad, but it's just to repeat the process over and over and over again. So you're drawing the dialectical circle ever and ever tighter. And realistically, at the end of this system, the only thing that's left is the individual. But obviously, once you get into the complications of murdering loads of people, you need other people to do that, and there's a certain point where they all want to live, and so they kind of resentfully team up and murder other people, but they hate each other, and you get that with Stalin. If the film about Stalin, which was based on Montefiore's Court of the Red Tsar, was absolutely hilarious, but it kind of represents how the Soviets all still ultimately hate each other and would murder one another, but unfortunately, it's the power games and the staying in control which kind of props the whole corrupt system up. So one of the key things is that labour is fundamentally done on nature. And here you can kind of see the moral aspect come back in from Marx's philosophy. So the incorrect form of reason, hence the incorrect tools, hence the incorrect way of doing labour, means that you're going to take the material from nature and you're going to basically sequester it off into the whole system of capital and fetishism and exploitation and depriving goods from the species because it's private property. And obviously that has a moral dimension because it means it's no longer free for the species, and so you obviously need to undo this. So labour is always going to be done on nature, but it's important that if you go as far as Marx is concerned through his system, then the labour will be essentially upright. It will be done in the correct way, with all the correct kind of obediences and prostrations and blah 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 blah, and it doesn't end up as private property. And so this is what makes it good. It's just it's the labelling which makes it good. The Marxists really love labels. So if you know a Marxist, then get them a label machine and they'll love it. Don't buy it though. The hurried social interchange of matter, the rapid disappearance of commodities from the sphere of circulation, and the equally rapid substitution of fresh ones in their place. So the idea here is that capital then starts to, and remember that capital is the universal aspect of the objectification of labour. This now begins to function as kind of a despot. It drives people to continue doing labour, to recapitulate their actions, And so you can kind of think of it as this voracious hoover, which is going throughout all of the material of creation and is trying to grasp it for itself. It's trying to possess all things. And so as soon as one thing is grasped and taken and transformed into something else, it's, thrown off into the ether where people need to fight and scrap against one another in order to possess it. But through virtue of essentially want, because not everyone will get one, then there's this drive to always take more material. So you've always got this process where you're taking matter from nature, ripping it up, forming it, but then in the exact same process, you've got this sense of need of deprivation, and this perpetuates the whole system to go forward again and to try and find more material to turn into new goods. And so everything that needs to be created is replaced, and it's just this endless use and abuse of nature through labour. And so the capital acts on people, and then they transform the materials from labour from one form to another. And then one of the casualties in this, as far as Marx is concerned, is the soil and its fertility. And so there's this recognition that you've got nutrients in the soil. You grow crops take those nutrients, they grow, and then we can harvest them and eat them. Now, as far as Marx is concerned, the system of labour means that the nutrients themselves are transferred to the capitalist, and this is a transfer in a few different senses. On the first, it's that the labour itself means that the capitalist is stealing an aspect of value from the nutrients which isn't available to the labourer. He had a concept of surplus value. So what you would, if you could imagine that you were building a car, there would be all the metals and all the different plastics and blah 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 that all put together and assembled to create a car, and then there's the tools and the actual labour itself that you've put into it. So assume that there's some sort of value V associated with all of that, and surplus value for Marx is that there's V plus C. So on top of the value of everything that's gone into the car, the capitalist puts an arbitrary value on top of it. So he basically overinflates the price, but then keeps all of that for himself without having actually added anything to the production process. So as far as Marx is concerned, you sacrifice other people by falsely inflating the price and stealing their labour and their efforts from them. Now, you can imagine that if you are having people who grow crops, who have farmland and so on and so forth, then that problem gets read into those productive systems as well. So there's a way that people are being robbed when they're producing the very food they eat. So they're producing food in order to partake in a system of slavery which crushes them and defeats them. But even then they're robbed. Even then they're being made to prep up the system of slavery and cruelty and evil. So even on the level of the food, the food should taste as ash in your mouth because you are so robbed. And you should not rest until you can eat pure food, which is free from the vagrancies and griping greed of the capitalist. So the very soil itself, the fertility is robbed, but then there's the double insult, of course, which is because they've been stealing this from you. They've got the money and the access to buy the better products, so they've got the more nutritious food. So your family, being a labourer, they don't get the nutritious food; they get the offcuts, the crappy stuff. It's less nutritious, so the health of your children suffers, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see that there's this real Puritan aspect throughout every idea in Marxism, which is that any kind of form of deviation from the absolute correct behaviour is the collapse into chaos of all of reality and every subderivative aspect of reality. But what takes place is that the person who's accrued all of this capital can then apply it back to the soil, generating technological advancements. And so as far as Marx is concerned, the technological advancement, it removes your ability to the necessity that the person must pay labour. So technological advancement, mechanization, these are actually anti-human instead of freeing up different possibilities, or instead of making it more efficient in farming. It also means that, instead of having the natural processes, then there are things like fertilizers, which are to subsidize the nutrient quality of the soil, even though this increases, crop yield and things like that, because it's underpinned by labor, so on and so forth, then obviously it's fundamentally evil. So one of the things that you don't really get Marx commenting on is how, soil degradation happens irrespective. The act of something growing is the act of something growing, and whether it's a communist one or whether it's a capitalist field and field of wheat and barley or whatever it happens to be, it's going to use the nutrients itself, and so the fertilizer is a subsidy to boost your crop yields, to replenish the fertility of the soil, so that we can continue to feed more people. That capital acting back on crop technology and fertilizer technology and mechanical technology is what allows us to have more people. It is what allows us to develop medical products so that there isn't so much attrition with human life. So yeah, dispensing with these things because they're apparently underpinned by labor is pretty nefarious. So capital directs labor and consumption of goods. So quote, therefore surplus value cannot be earth. Absolute fertility of the soil affects nothing more than the following. A certain quantity of labor produces a certain product in accordance with the natural fertility of the soil. So here again, like kind of saying, you can use money, industry, technology to develop fertilizers to subsidize the soil. Now, of course, with Marx's rhetorical framing of the knowledge we use to understand the world around us, and which obviously has a bearing on the moral valuation of objects and actions we take in relation to them, the surplus value here is going to be nested within the fertilizer itself. So of course, if you've got the fertilizer, the capitalist has paid for it, you've got the same problem of the value plus what the capitalist puts on top of it, and so even the profitability which comes from the fertilizer is supposedly sequestered off and stolen by the capitalist. So that's again the sacrifice of the life of the laborer or even the person who might own the land. And so again, differential rent is a social law carried through by means of competition. So again, he's not looking at, for example, like prices guiding the scarce use of resources. So that, I get that from Thomas Sowell. If you want to learn more about economics, then Thomas Sowell's got a brilliant book called Basic Economics, which I very much recommend checking out. Instead, prices are not to do with allocating resources in the entirety of the economy. And so if your purchasing power for that resource is high enough because you want it and there's enough resources backing you in order to use it for the application you desire, you could obviously buy it. Well, here differential rents are actually just something oppressive. It's the crude interpretation here is it's merely to squeeze more life out of the person. But the other reason why these two quotes are important is because they demonstrate that between economic and philosophic manuscripts and capital, there's actually a connection in his thought. And one of the things that you'll often hear Marxists say is that his earlier works were superseded by his later works. Well, what is meant by that is that the alchemical dialectical transformation has taken place. So he comes up with a set of critiques, that develops a whole set of theories, that lays out the map of what needs to now be critiqued and deposed through revolutionary action, and then through the deposing of those things and further critique, you establish new theories. So you've got this kind of this wave trough oscillation which is always happening. So you've got new critiques theories and they're implemented, and then that leads to the development of new theories and things which are reflected in consciousness. Well, when it comes to his ideas over long term, one of the things that will be said is that that these ideas have been superseded. So essentially, those old ideas where they happen to talk about the all the races needing to perish in the revolutionary Holocaust and things like that. Well, they eventually got past them, so it's not so bad. But in reality, what carries through is there's always core threads of ideas which are represented throughout the different levels of Marxist technological development, and I'm talking about technological in terms of their philosophical developments. So here it's useful to see the connection between the two, and it's also useful to understand that, if you're looking at Capital as providing the emotional basis which is to motivate the proletariat to take part in the moral action of reforming the entirety of reality, which necessitates the overthrow of the entirety of their family, society, and all the people who think, act, and hold the same morals as them, then it's very easy to understand why there is always this victimhood that's coming through. Victimhood is the bread and butter when it comes to leftism in motivating people to do terrible things. So you've got to avoid victimhood like the plague, because it's the tool of totalitarians. And it's easy to see how this thread of victimhood passes all the way through the early works right through to the later works. He described how the proletariat needed to know that they'd been destroyed, that they'd been slaves, and that the old system was inherently evil in order to motivate them to throw off society. So here you get the ensuing ideas that once you've got the wrong form of labour, then it is itself intrinsically wrong. It's intrinsically bad. And the idea from one of his later letters was that cultivation produces desertification. So if you've got the wrong form of labour, the wrong consciousness, and so on and so forth, it will actually turn the lands themselves into deserts. It will deplete all of the nutrients from the soil to the degree that all you'll be left with is sand, and then everyone will die. So again, there's not really the kind of reasoning where materials are returned to the soil, crop rotation, or things like fertilizer and things like this. It's always kind of very direct thinking. Is A always produces B. It's always extreme. It's always negative. It's always the death of everyone. But the only way that you can really induce otherwise reasonably well adjusted and typical people into exterminating everything around them and destroying all of the society around them, the only way that you can goad people into doing something so anti-human is to dress up an anti-human philosophy as its opposite. That's why the victimhood is so important. So the conclusion is that cultivation, when it proceeds in natural growth and is not consciously controlled, as a bourgeois he naturally does not reach this point, leaves deserts behind it. So there you go. If the Marxists don't obtain control, then the bourgeois will run all of the cultivation, they'll produce deserts, they'll kill all of us. So because the bourgeois have got the wrong consciousness, they're going to destroy all of us, it's going to be a genocide, therefore we must take control, we must implement our consciousness and our ideas, so on and so forth. And so that's the totalitarian justification. You create the golem of your own terror, and then you use that as the reason to impose your own ideas. That is very much a feature of Marxist thinking, is not only do you create the rhetorical questions and descriptions which justify your own victimhood and virtue, and but you also create the very thing that you're also running from. And so all these rhetorical descriptions of reality distort things so completely that people are in a complete mental derangement. They don't know where they're going, what they're running from, what the origin of either is. But if you're under assault by communists, then both the thing that you're running towards and the thing that you're running away from will both have been dialectically reformed, and they will both point towards the monadological goal. So as long as you can identify the monadological goal, and then the patterns of victimhood and so on and so forth, and the dialectical methodology, then you'll have a very comprehensive understanding of what the Marxists are up to in your nation or in that particular topic area. So Engels added some to this as well, and he says that there's the distinction between organic and inorganic nature. So if you recall, we were looking at synthesizing humanity to nature. So you've still got this aspect of the organic and the inorganic, and there's an exchange between the inorganic with the organic, and so this is described as a metabolism. That's actually Engels' idea, not Marx's. And so this concept of metabolism again, is quite useful for when you're thinking about it from the third subject, the monadological approach in Marxism, which is that it's like this collective body. There's really we are one with nature, and nature is one with us, and we're in communion with one another. We're taking material and transforming it, but it's all under the overarching entity, which is, all of nature and creation, and species being. So you've got this metabolism between inorganic nature being eaten by organic nature and then being excreted out. It returns to inorganic nature, but in the process, might kind of take a stop off and become part of our body, or energy which is used by our bodies, and so on and so forth. And then eventually we die, and then we return to nature. That's why you get someone like Mao saying that killing counter-revolutionaries is good because fertilizer is created. So you got this explicit metaphor of, when the proletariat are murdering people, they return to the ground, and then you can use that to revivify the soil to grow new crops and then to consume them through the crop. So that's the Marxists just doing their thing. So the materialist outlook on nature means nothing more than nature without alien addition. And so, again, it's a very simple line, but it demonstrates that really at the root of the Marxist and Engels philosophy, there is this core anti-human aspect, because everything which is not developed in line with their ideas is qualified as an alien addition. Especially, that includes morality. It's not clear that sentence refers specifically to morality, but one of the things is that alienation is in God and the divine and the Ten Commandments and so on and so forth. So alien addition is you want to get rid of those things. It doesn't necessarily mean that the humans themselves are an alien addition, but their ideas are that there certainly is a sort of order and hierarchy in terms of interacting with nature. The hierarchy that they prefer is humanity's union with nature. It's unclear how many people would actually continue to exist and survive. Obviously, with the penchant for incessant murder, probably not so many, but it's difficult to kind of put an actual number on it when it comes to their ideas. And that just there is the reiteration. So again, the split between subject and object, that would be a form of alien addition. God would be a form of alien addition. Churches, Ten Commandments, moral laws, anything which is developed from under the ideas of labor and so on and so forth, these would be alien additions. So you've got to go back, you've got to destroy all these things and then recreate them, underpinned by the form of socialist consciousness in Marxism. That socialist consciousness is obviously aware of the species being the monadological union of humanity to nature, and so on and so forth. So in summary, we've gone through quite a lot. We've got Marx's philosophic methodology. So this is the subject-object collapse. That's the dialectical aspect. And then you've got historicism, which is, you're always in a certain epoch, but you're trying to break with that epoch and then move into the new one. And then once you get to the end of history, as far as Marxism is concerned, you then enter a phase of constant revolution. So you're still really going through the same processes of doing away with the old ideology, the old fetishism, and then trying to come up with new revolutionary ideas. But that way you're supposedly free from the past, and you can construct something new. The clear moral framework or gauge which guides people's action is it alienated, and is it estranged, or is it not? If it's alienated, if it's estranged, evil, destroy it, tear it apart. If the person is alienated and estranged, likewise, evil, destroy them, tear them apart. And then it's only once they're reappropriated through dialectical philosophy that it's fine. Naturally, once it's constant revolution, even if you've at one time got rid of the alienation and estrangement, it's kind of creeping after you in a little bit of a sense. The old things can have alienation revealed in them, and you need to throw them down and come up with something new. So the process is constant. And of course, where the proletariat have moral contradiction within them because they straddle both epochs in history, then they're constantly doomed to annihilate their peers and themselves. It's fundamentally built in at the core of Marxism and all of dialectical philosophy. And later on, we'll explore how those ideas are applied in a new way. For example, when it's post-humanity, so things like transhumanism, biological and cybernetic augmentation. This is an alternative way of getting to a different kind of proletariat where you get rid of the old as an inferior and lesser form of human, because as far as they're concerned, human nature itself can be reformed by humans. And then we also have Engels' idea that biological life is contingent on the inorganic, and you obviously want to try and prevent any kind of alien addition to it. So this is basically return to nature, but with some of the perks in the production and the new ideas of Marx and Engels, of course, guiding us. They're the Prometheans the Promethean wizards who guide us into this new epoch. These are the works cited, and I hope you've enjoyed the presentation.